Good afternoon, depending on which time zone you're in. I think while people are joining, I'm just going to start with a few introductions with housekeeping. So welcome to this European Policies Research Center webinar. This is the third one this year. You can go back to our YouTube page to look at some of the past ones that we've had. My name is Liliana Fonseca, and I am a research associate at EPRC. And today we welcome Professor Giancarlo Cotella from the Politecnico di Torino, who will speak on the topic of the role of metropolitan areas within EU cohesion policy. As usual, our presentation will last about 30 minutes, and then this will be followed by the discussion, by Q&A. And if you would like to make an intervention, you can use the usual raise a hand function on Zoom. So that will be at the bottom of your screen in the React section. And you can also feel free to post a question in the chat, and we will try to address these then in the Q&A in the order in which they appeared. So the webinar is being recorded, which means that you and your colleagues will be able to follow the meeting at a later stage. It will be available on our YouTube channel, which is EPRC Strat, and it will also be shared with you by email. So feel free to also share the thoughts that you have or the recording on social media. So we'll share it on LinkedIn, on BlueSky. And now I will present our speaker. So Professor Giancarlo Cotella is a professor at the Interuniversity Department of Regional and Urban Studies and Planning of Politecnico di Torino. His research focuses on European territorial governance, in particular on the mutual influence occurring between European spatial planning and the spatial governance and planning systems characterizing the different member states. In recent years, he extended the scope of his comparative studies to extra-European contexts, and at the same time, he narrowed down the focus to specific aspects as metropolitan governance, sustainable urbanization, and the actual mechanisms adopted in the various countries to provide development and land use rights. Giancarlo has taught and done research as a visiting scholar in numerous institutions in Europe and beyond. And since 2023, he serves as a Secretary General of the Association of European Schools of Planning. So right now, I think I can give the floor to Giancarlo.
Thank you.
And feel free to share your presentation.
Thank you, Liliana. I will start sharing my presentation before anything else, so that I'm sure that it works. Do you see it now? And now you should see it in presentation mode. Yeah, continue condividere. Yes, good. Thank you very much. Thank you, Liliana. Thank you, Marina. And first of all, thank you for inviting me to this seminar series that I really appreciate. I really appreciate the work of EPRC, and I used the result of your work in many of my studies. So I'm very glad to contribute live this time. I mean, my presentation was already made by Liliana, so I don't have to say much more. I will start immediately on the focus of today's seminar, which is about how the European Union cohesion policy consider and includes the metropolitan dimension, meaning metropolitan areas, metropolitan institutions, and so on. This is the result, what I will talk about are the results of a project launched within the ESPON program, which was called the ESPON Metro, and which we ran some years ago. And I've been working on metropolitan matters for around 5 years now. So I will try to share my knowledge with you and hope what I say is interesting. I will start setting the context of why we had this project launched, then talk a bit about the project, and then provide some insights on the results, which I must admit are not encouraging for metropolitan areas. And then I will focus on some concluding taking point that can be taken away from the results and maybe something for future research. So the context is basically that, our development settlement system has been metropolitizing, if I can use the word, with metropolitan areas that have joined cities as engines of development. And this in Europe is particularly relevant because GDP is produced in metropolitan area for over 70%. However, what we mean by metropolitan is not the same thing for everybody. And the metropolitan phenomenon is really heterogeneous And this makes metropolitan matter and challenges at how to define and to address. And there's been attempt for time, I would say starting from the 2000, late 2000, to define what do we mean by metropolitan. Yeah, you see population of functional urban area here, and the methodology developed by the OECD together with the European Union, basically by Dijkstra, Poleman, and Veneri, to define univocally and to perimeter univocally metropolitan areas in Europe. And this is the result, you see it in the map, and this is a function of a commuting area of main core areas in you can see that no country in the European space is exempt from metropolization. Some countries are very much pervaded by metropolitan phenomena. So it's something that needs to be addressed. And it's something that needs to be addressed, especially because this increasing metropolization has put traditional special governance model into crisis. Because the traditional administrative units are ill-equipped to manage this phenomenon. You know, municipal boundaries find it difficult to manage and to contain phenomena that spill over from them, and that need cooperation and governance models and platform and arrangement. This led to experimentation, meaning that metropolitan areas in Europe has been both the reason for and the scope for institutional experimentation. And this experimentation is very heterogeneous, differentiates. Sometimes it comes from the bottom up with municipalities, the joint forces in order to manage phenomena that are not contained within traditional administrative boundaries. Sometimes it comes from the top with central government that superimpose on the counter an additional metropolitan administrative layer. And there are various approaches in Europe to manage metropolitan phenomena. In some cases, countries decided to introduce an additional metropolitan administration layer. The case of France with the Metropole, the case of Italy with Città Metropolitane. In some other cases, the reactions to the phenomena are policy-based. And we have the example of Poland and the Czech Republic that use the European Union integrated territorial investment to basically develop a national metropolitan policy. And these things work differently, produce different results, have different governance mechanism behind, are different in the involvement of public and private actors and the civic society, and so on and so forth. Metropolization is something that has been recognized as very relevant also by the European Union. This is again dates back at least 15 years ago. If you take the report Cities of Tomorrow that you see on the slide, it already was talking about the relevance of metropolization and the fact that metropolitan phenomena need to be taken for functional action. The same goes for what is written in the New Leipzig Charter that is promoting a functional approach, and the same is for the Territorial Agenda 2030. So little by little, the European Special Agenda has been acknowledging the need to act through functional perimeter, to promote metropolitan action. Not only metropolitan, as a matter of fact, in the sense that this functional action in the European agenda has also been pushed towards different type of other functional area. For instance, you have here the long-term vision for the EU rural area, and now the definition of EU functional rural areas. It doesn't stop at the discourse level. It also affected policies. ERDF are more and more including quotes to be earmarked on cities. It was 5%, now it is 8%. New tools introduced in 2014, like ITI, community-led local development, are explicitly focusing on promoting local cooperation. ITI has been used very much for promoting metropolitan governance and cooperation, and the new policy objectives, especially the one of bringing Europe closer to citizens of the 21-27 period, it is very much trying to push towards local cooperation and use of these new instruments. So there is an energy at the European Union level to acknowledge the metropolitan phenomena. However, despite this effort, to adopt suitable metropolitan governance in order to exploit this opportunity is still not yet there, because in the various country system, most metropolitan areas still lack the tools or the jurisdiction or the funding that would allow them to embrace this role. And they don't have a voice in the programming of the European Union cohesion policy. And they don't have a voice in deciding whether to use ITI or CLLD, because these decisions are taken above their head, mostly at the national or regional level. And this was the question that animated the project. So why it is so, and how can the situation change? How can it be improved? And this is what animated the stakeholders that proposed to undertake such research to ESP. ESPON Metro is a targeted analysis, meaning that there were stakeholders, metropolitan stakeholders, you see them on this slide, that decided to join forces and ask to ESPON to please finance a research on this method, on how to better engage metropolitan area in the European Union cohesion policy. And this is what the project was about. The project is a bit old now. It finished in 2021, so it's 4 years old. It focused on the period 2014-2020 with an eye on the 2020-27. The idea was to analyze and compare how the cohesion policy is having an added value on the planning and implementation of metropolitan policy, and the other way around, how the cohesion policy is engaging metropolitan authorities and metropolitan area in its programming and management. So here we have the policy question. What role metropolitan areas plays in the development, management, and implementation of the cohesion policy? And then question 2 and 3, that are about the added value of the cohesion policy on the one hand, the planning and implementation of metropolitan policy, and on the other hand, in further consolidating metropolitan governance and cooperation. We explored this issue not from a pan-European perspective, that was not possible with the time and the resources we had, but on the basis of case studies, deep case studies. And we used a tandem approach. We had these 9 case studies that correspond to the territories where the stakeholders proposing the project were located. So Metropolitan City of Turin, Barcelona, Lisbon, Brno, Dansdinia Sopot, the 3 cities, Florence, Lyon, Brussels, and Riga. And we had one research partner in each of these contexts, and they interacted bilaterally for almost 1 year, having interviews, collection of data, and so on. And then we have some horizontal moment for comparison. No? So what we tried to analyze was, on the one end, and this was the most important thing to start the project, was, okay, how do metropolitan governance, without taking into account the cohesion policy, works in these 9 contexts? And we found out that this very heterogeneous framework, what it comes out from the analysis. On the other hand, we try to understand, okay, in the countries where those metropolitan areas are located, how is the cohesion policy organized? And then we try to match the plug and the socket. So how does the cohesion policy in the countries where these metropolitan areas are located take into account metropolitan matters, and metropolitan authorities are engaged in the programming and in the implementation, management and implementation of metropolitan governance? So we are different part of the equation. It's not only about how the cohesion policy consider metropolitan matter, but it's also how metropolitan matters arise within the various countries. And this was very differential. So we had, of course, a beginning, a first step of the activity where we try to figure out how to produce the research, how to engage with the stakeholder. And then we started to collect and analyze data. First of all, on the background information on the territorial, institutional, and policy framework of the various places, and then on the governance of the cohesion policy and its impact. And then we put everything together at various stages in the project in order to produce policy recommendation. And this is what this type of studies from ESPON do, is mostly to collect knowledge to produce evidence-based policy recommendation. I will move directly to the results so that we don't lose too much time on that. And I start with the first thing that we did to try to figure out how the metropolitan manifests in Europe. What do we mean by metropolitan in the countries at stake? We figure out that the EU metropolitan dimension is very heterogeneous, and is very heterogeneous both in terms of territorial, socioeconomic, and demographic characteristics of what we label as functional urban area, for which we use the EU OECD methodology that I mentioned before. But we also notice that the fit between the territorial phenomena and the institutional phenomena that these institutions should deal with is missing, or mostly happening in a random way. You can see it in the picture. You see on the top left, Metropolitan City of Torino. The yellow area is the area which is covered by the Torino Città Metropolitana, the formal institution. You see the black diagonal lines, they mark the functional urban area. So you can clearly understand that an authority that has to take care of that territory so broad that goes from the functional urban area up to the mountains to the border with France cannot really take care only on metropolitan matters, but they had to plan at different speeds in their activity. On the other way around, you see on the bottom right, the metropolitan area of Lyon is the opposite. You see the functional urban area, how much broader is in relation to the functional urban area. So it means that for the Metropolitan Authority of Lyon, the Métropole de Lyon, to produce truly metropolitan policies and actions, it means to find out alliances and coordination with actors outside this perimeter. And this is something that you figure out in all the cases that you have on the slide. Just some data. When you compare the orange dots, that is the metropolitan area under an institutional responsibility, and the blue one, that is the functional urban area, the phenomena considered according to the methodology I mentioned before, you see that there are differences. Yeah, you see in some cases, the metropolitan authority is larger, so it has to take care of a territory that is very heterogeneous. It's not only metropolitan, it's not only urban, the case of Torino, but also the case of Dunston and Sopot. You see other cases, like for instance, Lyon, Brussels, or Barcelona, in which the authority is not responsible to produce development plans and strategy for the whole metropolitan area. So in some cases, there is an overlapping. When it comes to the population, is the same, but also when it comes to number of municipalities, there is quite a big heterogeneity. And this again is very relevant. You see the metropolitan city of Turin, the metropolitan authority has 312 municipalities within itself. It means a big effort in terms of coordination of their action. When you take, on the other end, Lisbon, you see the metropolitan authority has only 18 municipalities. It means it's easier, yeah, to sit actors at the table, no, and have them talk and agree together on joint strategies. Heterogeneity also concern when and how these metropolitan authorities came into being. In Italy, this is something that started to be discussed in the 90s, and then in the 2014, metropolitan cities were created, were introduced, instituted. The same is in France. If you take the case of Lyon, the case of France in general is happened long before. If you take the case of Riga, there is not yet a formal metropolitan authority. There was at a certain point the Riga planning region, and that is still there, but is now the moment in which the authority is institutionalized. So again, also this is path-dependent institutional process very much influence the institutional shape of metropolitan authorities that have been put together. And the same is true when it comes to the weapon that they have, the tool that they have to deal with territorial development. And you see here is we try to list and to survey all the instruments that they have in their hand. In some cases, metropolitan authorities are mostly responsible for sectoral instruments. In some cases, they are mostly responsible for programming resources. In other cases, they do actual spatial planning up to the point of land use planning in some cases and so on. So for the European cohesion policy to actually engage with metropolitan authorities means to take into account this higher heterogeneity. And this is why this didn't happen very much. And we will see it now. Again, the engagement of metropolitan area in the cohesion policy is differential, as it is differential the metropolitan phenomena in Europe. It is differential for the heterogeneity that we witness and that I mentioned before in terms of the metropolitan phenomena and the metropolitan institutionalization in Europe, but it is also heterogeneous because the cohesion policy, by definition, by its own architecture at the European level, allows a very much leeway to the member state on how to organize. So you can see this on the map. There are countries that are very much regionalized in the management of the cohesion policy, some other that are centralized, some other that are mixed, and so on. And how each country decide to manage the cohesion policy influence very much the room for engaging with metropolitan actors. We have here picture of how metropolitan areas were consulted in the definition of the cohesion policy 21-27, so the one that is active now. And you can see that in the partnership agreement that is signed between the country and the EU, only the Barcelona case, there was a formal consultation. And when it comes to the national operational program, only the Riga metropolitan area that was just in way of being instituted was there consulted formally. Now, the situation is a bit better when it comes to the regional operational program. But in some cases, you will see no consultation at all happen. And why it is so? Well, for the period 2014-2020, this depends mostly on two issues. The first issue is that many of the metropolitan authorities that we are talking about in our research did not exist when the negotiation occurred. In 2014 and 2012, the metropolitan city of Italy and many of the metropoles in France didn't exist as a formal institutional authority, so were not consulted. In some other cases, it is because of their exceptionality. If you take the case of Barcelona, Barcelona is one of a kind in Spain. So when it was the case of discussing the programming of the cohesion policy in Spain, it was easier for the Spanish ministries to contact the unions of municipality than to involve Barcelona as such as an exceptional metropolitan area. Barcelona jumped in later on in a negotiation with the Catalonian government. So I just said that metropolitan authorities were not involved in the programming of the cohesion policy. The situation changes a bit when it comes to its management, so the management of the resources. Again, here, the situation is rather differential. When it comes to the management of the cohesion policy, in some cases, metropolitan authorities were devolved the management of specific priorities of the regional operational program. This is the case of Italy, for instance. In the case of Torino, the metropolitan city was devolved the responsibility for managing some axes and priorities of the European Social Fund regional operational program. In some cases, ad hoc agreements with dedicated funding envelopes were put in place, and this is the case of Barcelona. Barcelona Metropolitan Authority manages a chunk of money of the plan of the regional operational program of Catalonia. And in some other cases, and this is probably the most interesting cases we have, integrated territorial investment were used by the national authority to program a dedicated national metropolitan policy. This is the case of the Czech Republic and Poland that basically created a mechanism that allows all metropolitan areas in the countries to benefit from their own integrated territorial investment. For instance, the metropolitan area that we studied, Danstigna Sopot, they had their own ITI that managed the part of the resources of the voivodeship regional operational program. So you see on the map, ITI were used very much to allow metropolitan authority to manage cohesion policy resources. This is the case, as I say, in Czech Republic and Poland. This is also the case in France with Lyon, you see there, and the case of Portugal with Lisbon. However, it is up to each country to decide whether to use or not ITI and how to use them. So you see this blue country are those that use ITI for metropolitan policy. But then there are other countries that use ITI for other issues, for rural policies, or anyway, for non-metropolitan policies. And there are other countries that didn't use ITI at all. So the use of ITI itself is not something that the metropolitan authority can decide on its own. A last example I bring to you on the management of resources comes from Italy. Italy introduced one national operational program specifically dedicated to metropolitan cities. This was very interesting because in 2014, metropolitan cities were created, and then the government introduced a metropolitan national operational program, so delivering money to those 14 cities. However, and this is where the king is naked somehow, the resources were not given to manage to the actual metropolitan authority, but to the main municipality located within this metropolitan authority. And this somehow disempowered This decision disempower the Metropolitan Authority by giving a lot of resources to manage to its main city. There are different institutions, the main city of the Metropolitan Authority and the Metropolitan Authority itself. Let's move now to the added value of the cohesion policy for planning and implementation of metropolitan policy. This again depends of many different variables. For instance, on what are the programs that actually deliver resources to the metropolitan territory, and this changes a lot, as you can hint from the table on the side. It very much depends on the magnitude of the resources. Yeah, some of the countries in which our case studies were located are what we call cohesion countries. They receive quite a large share of money, anyway, money that are an important part of their public spending. Yeah, you see where is plus and plus on the slide. It means that the resources do make a difference. So there is a lot of resources landing on the metropolitan territory and a lot of resources that are actually managed by the Metropolitan Authority. This was the case of the two ITI of Brno and DIST and so forth. When you go on the other extreme, the orange bullet that you see, you have cases in which the cohesion policy in those territories do not constitute the lion's share of public expenditure, and anyway, the authority either do not exist or do not have a lot of say in how the money were managed. And here we move on the interlinkages between the priorities of the cohesion policy and the priorities of metropolitan authorities, the territorial priorities, and the dynamics that manifest between these two things. We have 4 different cases here. We have cases in which metropolitan authority do manage European Union funds and have their own metropolitan agenda. And here you have circular dynamics of mutual influence with the metropolitan authorities that can take on board some influence from what are the priorities of the cohesion policy. And on the other way around, they can use their own agenda and the priorities of their own agenda to program the resources that they manage from the cohesion policy. In some cases, we do have cases in which there is a metropolitan agenda, independent, because there are metropolitan authorities. This is the case of Turin and Florence, but there is not much management of European Union resources, and therefore the agenda of the metropolitan authority will try to modify its priority in order to then finance the action deriving from this priority from the resources of the cohesion policy. So the metropolitan agenda follows the priority of the cohesion policy. In some other cases, like we had the case of Riga and Brussels, there was no influence at all in the sense that in these cases, Riga was not existing yet as a metropolitan authority, and Brussels, we do have Brussels capital region, but when we talk about Brussels metropolitan area, is much larger than that, and there is no mechanism of coordination for handling between Flanders, Wallonia, and Brussels to handle territorial action on the larger area. And the last piece of result I present to you is what has been the role of cohesion policy in consolidating metropolitan governance. This is interesting because we can either detect an explicit influence or an implicit influence between the cohesion policy growing attention to metropolitan area and the consolidation of metropolitan governance and cooperation. You take the examples of Brno and DIST Dynia Sopot, so the Polish and the Czech examples. The fact that the central government somehow use European Union resources and the ITI tool to put in place a national metropolitan policy create a great momentum for metropolization, for the introduction of metropolitan institutions in the country. And this is true in Poland, in which this was a period in which a law allowed now for metropolitan authority to be actually instituted. It happened only in one case, in the Silesia region, but still there is room for more. And anyway, from the bottom up, this claim towards metropolization is still present because of the ITI. And the same is true for the Czech Republic. When we were talking with the Brno actors, the main claim that they want to sustain for the project was that now that they have managed the ATI, they need formal institutionalization as a metropolitan authority, because otherwise, when the resources fade, they also fade in terms of cooperation. And you can also say that in other cases, like for instance, in the case of Italy, but also in the case of Riga a bit, the cohesion policy was implicitly pushing towards the institution of metropolitan authority. This is clear when you read the law that institute, the text of the law that institute metropolitan authorities in Italy, that clearly says that these new città metropolitane should play a role in European matters. So basically, the European Union cohesion policy has been included into the law, or European matter has been included into the law as a competence for Città Metropolitana. What has then happened on the ground is another thing, because the regions are very much unkeen to devolve power to metropolitan cities for the management of the cohesion policy, but the law had this idea. A last point concerns how the management of resources, in the case when this was possible by metropolitan institution, allowed metropolitan authority to increase the coordination with its own municipalities, with the municipality in its own territory. This was also very interesting. Yeah. More than the actual impact of the ground on the ground of the resources that the metropolitan authority manage in terms of cohesion policy, what was relevant for the actors that we interviewed was the fact that through these resources, it was possible for them to leverage the cooperation and action of the municipality that they have in their territory. So basically, they could use the cohesion policy as a leverage for developing a joint metropolitan sentiment and a joint metropolitan action. And this was particularly interesting for us, especially in cases like the one of the metropolitan city of Torino, in which the territory is so heterogeneous that many of the municipality, of the 312 municipalities that belong to the metropolitan city of Torino, don't feel metropolitan at all, because they are maybe municipalities of 50 people on the top of mountains, and they don't feel they belong to a metropolitan institution. But with the fact that the metropolitan authority has resources to use as a leverage, they sat at the table and they started to engage with metropolitan government. Okay, I'm done. I will just move to some conclusive remark. And the first one concerns what I already said. The metropolitan phenomenon and its governance are very much heterogeneous in Europe, and there is not much action, there is not much effort towards understanding it. There are, however, associations and institutions that try to bridge the gap. We were in touch with them during the project, with Matrix, Eurocities, Metropolis, and so on. And from all sides, it was clear that there is a need to develop further knowledge on how the Metropolitan is being institutionalized in the various countries. We are trying to do that. You can see on this slide, this is just a more recent research that we produced. We try to figure out, okay, which countries are actually instituting formal metropolitan governance, which countries have some sort of policy-based metropolitan governance, which country manage metropolitan matter in an exceptional way, like for instance, in the case of Barcelona in Spain, or the case of Brussels in Belgium, and so on. And then there are countries in Europe that do not need a national metropolitan governance system. Yeah, because for instance, they are very monocentric and they do have one large metropolitan city. So they should focus just on that in an exceptional manner. When it comes to the engagement of metropolitan area in the cohesion policy, this has been very limited. It's been very limited in the 14-20. It's a bit better in the 21-27, but mostly because of the reason that in the programming of the 14-20 period, metropolitan authorities in countries like France and Italy didn't exist, and then they existed. So somehow they were engaged a bit more. But we are still far from a situation in which they can autonomously decide what resources to manage and how. There is a big inertia from regions in countries that are regionalized to somehow devolve part of the management. And this was evident when it comes to the Recovery and Resilience Facility framework. Everything in most countries was managed centrally. and resources to be managed by metropolitan authorities were very limited. We do have an exception here in Italy, in which the metropolitan city were given the responsibility for what we call PUI, Urban Integrated Program. We still don't see the result of that, but it's quite a good practice, I would say, in Europe, in which metropolitan authorities were given the responsibility to actually manage what to do with their own resources by developing their own integrated program for spending them. Beside that, the most interesting arrangement for managing resources was, according to our result, the ITI, and the ITI dedicated to integrated metropolitan development. And this was clear when we were discussing with the various authorities, not only in Poland and the Czech Republic, but also in Lisbon and Lyon. However, those actors that were responsible for managing ITI say, yes, ITI is very important, but we need formal institutionalization. While the countries that had formal institutional metropolitan authorities say, yes, we are formally institutionalized, but we are not flexible because of that, and we would need to manage resources for a tool like the ITI. So there was different views in that sense. Other arrangements are also interesting, and we have the National Operational Program in Italy for metro area. This was renewed for this period, and again, it is managed by the central municipality and not by the metropolitan authority. So sometimes, in some cases, it's a bit of a delusion, because we thought that the next step would be to give the metropolitan authority the actual management of the money, and it didn't happen. When it comes to the added value that the cohesion policy may produce on metropolitan matters, so in the planning and implementation of metropolitan policy and so on, this varies a lot and depend, according to us, to three main factors. One is the magnitude. We cannot really, magnitude of resources. We cannot really think about any added value when we talk about countries in which the cohesion policy deliver very few resources. In the sense that usually these resources are programmed as somehow reinforcing other resource pockets that the government has. And they cannot really act as a catalyst for metropolitan development. So to have a good amount of resources to be spent on metropolitan matters is something important. To have actually institutionalized metropolitan governance is another thing that facilitates to have an added value, because you have an institution which is responsible for planning its own priority, and the devolution of the management of the resources to that institution is a third condition. We produce this sort of typology here, where you have high average or low magnitude of funding, and then the direct or indirect management of the funding, and highly or lowly institutionalized metropolitan authority. And you see we score the high added value in the cases in which you have quite a high amount of fund and a higher level institutionalization. The funding is the most important thing, the magnitude of the funding, but then also the direct management. And last slide. Despite the differential impact on the ground, the cohesion policy did contribute to consolidate metropolitan governance and cooperation, and it allowed the metropolitan authority to gain recognition locally with its own municipalities and with public and private actors, because there were resources to be used as a leverage in order to create a metropolitan sentiment, as I mentioned before. I close with one last slide. We are talking about metropolitan and cohesion policy, and in the last years I've been engaged in another project that focus on the matter and also another matter, and I start to think, is metropolitan all that matters? Shall we focus so much only on the cohesion policy and metropolitan authority? Is metropolitan the only way to think in functional terms? And I give you this example from an interesting project that I've been recently working on, which is called Geo, non-standard geographies. There are other functionalities, there are other functional phenomena that are not necessarily metropolitan and that may require cohesion policy resources. You have on the left is still metropolitan, is Paris water provision system. is still metropolitan, but is very sectoral. So the organization of water provision in a time of increasing impact of climate change requires very much governance and coordination and resources. And this is something that we may think of. We have ecological corridors and ecological protection, which is something that very much cross borders in a functional way. On the right, you have the example of a functional territory for industrial transition. In Spain is one of these the territory of one of these territorial just transition plans that the European Union is financing. So these are all ways, all various ways to think in functional terms that are not necessarily metropolitan. So there is a big attention, there has been for years now a big attention metropolitan as the only or mostly only functional way to program and to think about how to program the cohesion policy, but there are also other things that maybe we should take into account. And that's it. Thank you very much. I hope it was not too boring.
Thank you very much, Giancarlo. No, it's not boring at all. Very interesting. I think we can open the floor now to questions. Anyone that would like to come in already? Let me see if I can see all of you. Yes, Martin?
Yes, thanks a lot. Thank you, Giancarlo, for a very nice presentation. What a great project it must have been, and also interesting new directions that you're exploring. I have a number of questions, but I'll just ask just one. And I think the one I would choose concerns the relation between cohesion policy and spatial planning in those cases that you studied. I think you mentioned at some point that in some of the cases, the metropolitan authorities had a planning competence. And I was wondering, what did you observe in the project when it comes to relations and kind of maybe linkages, synergies between planning and cohesion policy? And what lessons could be drawn from this? And would you advocate a closer link between planning and cohesion policy, especially those kind of tools that support metropolitan governance like ITI in the future?
Thank you. Yes, I do advocate a closer link between the cohesion policy and spatial planning. We've been talking about it for years now, and I think this is very important. I can make you the example of the case of the Italian Città Metropolitana. The Italian Città Metropolitana have a competence for strategic planning and for territorial coordination planning. The strategic planning is the one that we consider in European jargon spatial planning. However, they don't have resources, or they have very scarce resources. So what they do is that they produce their strategic plan that lasts only for 3 years. That's something that is another problem, but still they produce their strategic plan, basically setting the priority of the strategic plan on the funding channels that the region put in the regional operational program, because they don't directly manage the resources and they have no way to finance what they put on the plan. So they put the similar priority in a way to somehow activate funnels, so that when there is a call or when there is a possibility to apply for resources, they can, because they show that they have the strategic plan talking about that. But this means that their priority is predefined by the region. So it limits the authority of the Metropolitan Authority. You see. So this is something that shows how a stronger link would help by giving the possibility for Metropolitan Authority to program its own resources and manage it. Then, it would facilitate things. And ITI is helpful for that, because it allows the authority that is owning the ITI to actually program on its own resources. We saw it clearly with the Polish case. Although I know that there is a lot of criticism going on, but still, it was a positive example from our experience if you look at it from the outside. And the same was in the SEC case. And again, we noticed in other cases in which to have the possibility to define for a metropolitan authority to define their own agenda for development, so their own priorities, their own plans or strategies, and then to have resources to attach to it. So when these happen at the same level, it allows for freedom, for independence, and this makes very much sense in my opinion. Last example for this: Barcelona. Barcelona got its own envelope of resources, Barcelona Metropolitan Authority, so they could do that. That's very good. However, then the municipality of Barcelona got its own envelope of resources. So this created donut effect. The Metropolitan Authority basically does its own action planning, we can call it, special planning. Then they have Barcelona as a city that does its own. So again, this is something that these are all governance clashes that somehow need require attention.
Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Thank
you. Martin, I see you've unmuted yourself. Do you want to come in?
Thanks, Liliana. Hi, Giancarlo. Martin Ferry, working at the European Policy Research Centre. Thanks for a great presentation. And we've been responsible for the ex post evaluation of the cohesion policy territorial instruments in 2014 to 20. Lots of the findings and insights that you've highlighted there have echoed or reflected the findings that we've came to. So just a couple of points which kind of pick up on some of the issues you've raised. One is that we found was if you like, the asymmetry even within countries, the heterogeneity even within countries in terms of metropolitan or functional urban area capacities and identities and structures, and how this was a challenge for cohesion policy to map onto, and what that meant for the added value that cohesion policy could bring in that way. Even looking at Poland in particular, which was a focus for a lot of our research, because this is, as you said, a prominent example of where cohesion policy could play a role, because Poland decided to use ITI to further the functional urban area or metropolitan area agenda. But even there, I mean, there were two ways that a functional urban area could engage in ITI in that way in Poland. One was to have an association of municipalities that covered this area. And that tended to happen where there was already existing frameworks and partnership and cooperation in place. And there you could see how cohesion policy came in, built on this, developed this identity more and more, contributed to it. The other way was to have an agreement between the core city and its surrounding municipalities, which basically meant that the core city led on this. So it dominated the ITI in a sense. Now you could say from that point of view the added value there was limited, but we found that this was an important stepping point or stage in the evolution of the identity. The example we looked at was in Lublin, where the core city dominated the ITI process, but it represented the first time that all the municipalities had kind of got around the table to talk about functional linkages in terms of how investment was made. So in a sense, we argued that in terms of added value, you have to take into account the starting point, where the capacity is to begin with, and then look at how that has evolved. And one thing that we found now is looking at 2021-27 in Lublin, they've moved from this like formal agreement to an association, which we see as like an important step in capacity building overall. So really it's just kind of backing up some of the points that you've made in terms of this asymmetry even within countries, which makes it complex for cohesion policy to engage with, but also to keep in mind different benchmarks and how you calculate the added value that cohesion policy brings.
Yeah, if I can react, I fully agree with you, and thank you for bringing this. We couldn't have this like horizontal view in the various countries because we had just one case per country. But I tend to agree because it's the same in Italy, although our metropolitan cities are institutionalized and so on. You have to consider the starting point, and you have to consider different type of added value. In the sense that if you consider only the economic return of every euro you spend on a territory, then you don't manage to get a clear picture. The added value you just mentioned, so to enhance cooperation, to generate a metropolitan sentiment, to generate a momentum towards metropolitan cooperation in a territory, it is an added value, although it is not economically measurable in the short term. So I fully agree with you. And if we don't come to terms with the idea that we don't have to measure only economic return of the cohesion policy spending, then we don't produce this added value, this second type of added value that will allow for producing economic added value in the future. I fully agree.
Exactly. Thanks, Giancarlo. That was the argument that we've made in the evaluation itself. So thanks.
Thank you. And I have Pierre here with hand raised. I don't know if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Hello, good morning. My name is Pier Paolo Saraceno. I work at the Joint Research Center. And thank you, Giancarlo, for the very interesting presentation. I just wanted to ask a question related on, you mentioned this differentiation between those metropolitan areas who manage funds at the level of the Metropolitan Authority and those who manage the fund but at the city level. So like the difference between Gdansk, to make it clear, and Turin, for instance. And the question is, I don't know if it's something that you analyze, but did you see any difference between the strategic nature of the intervention that were funded between those metropolitan area like Gdansk and the other cases like the one in Turin where they manage the funds at the level of the main city? So basically, like, were projects funded by those metropolitan areas who manage directly the funds more metropolitan, let's say, in nature, comparing to projects that were funded by Turin, for instance? Is something that you analyzed?
We didn't analyze it specifically, but there are differences, I can say, in the sense that when there is the case of Poland with Tanzania Support Association that manage the ITI resources on the whole territory of what we call Metropolitan Authority, although it's mostly an association of municipalities around Tanzania Support, then you can see, and the same is in Brno, Metropolitan Authority. The thing, what you see is that there is a clear metropolitan value in the intervention that they produce. They, for instance, favor transportation links, the transportation system. They favor spreading out of a different type of housing. They have a metropolitan added value in the nature of the intervention that they propose. When you go to the case of Turin or the case of Florence, that we made both examples, this sometimes happens because, as I say before, the Metropolitan Authority was responsible for some tiny bit of money from the ESF ROP. And when they program this money, they try to have this added value because they want to have, they want their intervention to be recognized as metropolitan. But when you take the resources that go to the municipality of Torino instead for the national operational program, they were mostly spent because of the rules of the program on the territory of the municipality, because all the material, all the interventions that produce a physical impact, they were to be located within the boundary of the main municipality, while those that were not physical and material in their nature, they could be located outside. This was in the rules. One exception in that sense is the case of Florence, that for the national operational program, they tried to think metropolitan. That was very interesting. It was the time of the COVID, so they tried to insist very much on bike lines to promote active and non-crowded mobility, let's say, by empowering, strengthening the bike lines network at the metropolitan level. Although they had trouble because they couldn't really spend the money for physical infrastructure outside the boundaries of Florence. So, but it depends if you give the money to the central municipality, it depends. To think metropolitan is a choice and is not a must. Well, if you give the money to the Metropolitan Authority, they have to think metropolitan because it's the way that they will benefit then also politically. Thank you for your question, Pier Paolo.
Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder if there's anyone else that wanted to come in before we wrap up for today? If not, then I hope you don't mind, Giancarlo. I have a question of my own, and that maybe can leave you with a good final commentary. So how do you think cohesion policy can evolve to better account for the increasing interdependence of economic interdependence, environmental interdependence of urban and surrounding non-urban areas?
I think cohesion policy can hardly evolve if it keeps allowing the member states to take decisions on their own to such a large extent. This is my main opinion. If the leeway that national government have on adopting, for instance, instruments like ITI or CLLD remains the same, then there is very, very, very few that the cohesion policy itself can do, because then most of the decisions are in the end of someone else at lower levels, and this means that it will depend on each country to produce results on one thing or another. For instance, of course, the European Union cannot force national authorities to do in a way or another, but you can motivate by economic conditionality. You can earmark part of the budget, for instance. If you earmark larger part of the budget for ITI, then maybe you push towards the adoption of ITI. And you can do the same for other instruments, or you can earmark a share of the ERDF not only to urban matters and to cities, but to metropolitan matters. There are various ways. And I think these little leverages and conditionalities are the way to go if you want to push the countries a bit, to act on a specific direction. Because otherwise, you will always have countries that do not feel that this is the way to go, and they will not do it. Like I was really mad when I was drafting this map on where the ITI were used and where not and how. And even when I see that in Italy they are used, and then I know the situation in Italy, and I can clearly tell you the ITI were not used as the ITI should be used. They were mostly used as a contractual agreements, but not really for producing integrated territorial development.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good point. And I think then we can finish for today as we're coming up to the hour. So thank you again, Giancarlo, for accepting our invitation and for your presentation. And of course, thank you to everyone who attended today and your interest in today's webinar. I just wanted to remind everyone that our fourth webinar of the spring semester will be on the 14th of May with Nancy Duxbury, Julius Heinecke, and André Torre from the In Situ project, who will present on place-based innovation of cultural and creative work in non-urban areas. So it's going to be a nice follow-up. Contact us, of course, to register for our mailing list and keep up to date on other webinars and future events. And we hope to see you all again.
Thank you. Thank you for joining.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye.